Alan with Albuquerque Gardening. Yesterday, Sunday, we did a class at the Albuquerque Garden Center showing how I grew my 947-pound pumpkin last year. This is a copy of that. If you were at the class, thanks for coming, and if you weren't, I hope you're able to find some good information here. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.
So let's welcome Alan.
Well, first off, thank you all for coming in. I know it's Sunday, it's supposed to be a day of rest, but we're doing a day of learning, so I really appreciate you all taking the time to come over here and to learn how I did this. Before I start, I need my laser pointer. It's the shape of a mouse, so that's nice. Walmart ran out of regular ones. So this is the story and the procedures of how I grew my almost 950-pound pumpkin. And down here, you can follow my gardening channel on YouTube at Albuquerque Gardening. I'll also be posting this class up there later this week for anybody who either missed it or if you want any extra notes, things to look back over, that'll be available. Some of the things we'll cover are seed selection and genetics, space requirements, soil testing and amendments, pest control, as well as timelines, the daily care needs, and some of the environmental factors that you'll run into trying to grow a giant in the desert. It's not as forgiving here, so we've got some solutions. Something I get asked a lot is who got me into giant pumpkins, and for millennials and other people around our age, I'm sure it's a similar answer. The Stinky Peterson from Hey Arnold, a classic kids cartoon. So he grew a big old pumpkin and they ended up playing cards in it after they harvested it. So if anything, I'd like to do that this year and have a nice card game inside of my pumpkin. So starting off, there's two types of pumpkins that can be grown. They're in different families. The regular jack-o'-lantern field pumpkin is of the Cucurbita pepo variety, and the Atlantic Giant, which is the one that I grew, falls under the Cucurbita maxima. And fun thing about these is these two cannot cross-pollinate, so if you have a regular jack-o'-lantern and an Atlantic Giant, they won't cross-pollinate. However, you can cross-pollinate anything that's in this family. So one of the things we're going to also cover is not letting the bees do all the work, because bees mean well, but they don't know what they're doing in terms of pollination. Buying seeds is probably one of the bigger factors. You can find Atlantic Giant seeds online on like Amazon, but most of the time those pumpkins are grown for the purpose of seed distribution and not necessarily growing a giant pumpkin and only trying to grow a giant pumpkin. So when it comes to seeds, you want to make sure that the seeds you're getting are from another giant pumpkin itself. And as you can see, these are regular pumpkin seeds. And these are Atlantic Giant seeds. They're significantly larger. When it comes to seeds, you get what you pay for. My first year of trying to grow giant ones, I ended up with ones that were about 53 pounds. I paid $2 for the seeds through the MI Gardener Seed Shop. They were labeled State Fair winner, but as I found out that year, that's just a brand name. And when it comes to premium genetics, this is a picture of the current world record pumpkin, 2,749 pounds, grown by Travis Ginger in the year 2023. And when it comes to these seeds, you're going to pay from anything from $5 a seed up to this one's $350 a seed because they're that highly sought after. When it comes to selecting the genetics, you have choices. You have, pale, flesh, kind of peachy colored pumpkins, a little bit gray. You have bright orange ones, you have dark orange ones. You have pumpkins that are shaped like bean bags or pumpkins that are real uniform in their shape. Personally, I like these ones. Just big, traditional, looks like a pumpkin, and it doesn't encourage people to try to sit in them. So when you're shopping for seeds for Atlantic Giants, there's going to be all these weird little numbers and statistics, and basically they name these by 3 data points. The first one is, like in this instance, 2907, that's the weight of the pumpkin. The patent in this case is the name of the grower, and then the year it was grown, 2022. Now technically, a larger pumpkin has been grown than the world record one. This is the world record seed with the $350 seeds. But a 2,900 pound pumpkin was grown, but it was damaged, therefore it doesn't count. Yeah, it doesn't, there's a whole thing with the Giant Pumpkin Commonwealth. We'll talk about that later. They're the governing body that dictates the way that these things get weighed, and they come up with the rules for all this stuff.
I have a question. When you say damage, should we talk about like something happened to the pumpkin in transit, or while it was growing, it split open?
Could be either. So most of the time, people will have a damaged pumpkin that splits open, or mice will get to it, and things like that. So this year, I went ahead and picked the seeds from the Colorado state record holder for 2024. His name's Brad Bledsoe, and what I'm selecting this year is seeds from a 2083, so 2,083 pound pumpkin. And I picked it because, so on these different progeny sites, as I was showing earlier, this site here, you can actually click on these individual seeds and find out what these were pollinated with. So you can see generations back, there's like a family tree for these pumpkins, and you can see all the different people that grew these in the different climates. And I selected the ones that I selected because, for one, Colorado is a pretty similar high kind of desert climate to us in a lot of ways, especially where this guy was growing. And the seeds that he grew specifically came from 2 different pumpkins, one grown in Utah, another kind of deserty, dry place, and they have apparently great heat tolerance. So that's one of these factors you can look for when you're shopping for seeds. Last year, the seeds I used came from a 966 pound Howard Dill Award winner. Now, the Howard Dill Award is essentially an award for the prettiest Halloween-style jack-o'-lantern looking pumpkin. And that's kind of its own little category. Sometimes you will see at some of these regional weigh-offs 2,000 pound Howard Dill Award winners. I went with a nice smaller one because, this is my 4th year. I had 3 years of failures, and we'll show some of those failures from previous years and what I learned in the process. So I just wanted to get one that was going to be nice, bright, pretty pumpkin that was a uniform shape. So this is, this is what I grew last year. This is what I'm going to be growing this year. Here's some resources that you can look for seeds. You got Worldwide Giant Growers, the St. Croix Growers Association, greatpumpkin.net, worldclassgardening.com, or if you're on Facebook, the Backyard Giant Pumpkin Growers group. You can also find people on Instagram who grow giant pumpkins, and if you reach out to them, sometimes they're nice enough to say, just send me a self-addressed envelope and I'll send you some seeds. You just got to cover the postage. So you'll find that pumpkin growers are extremely generous in that way, and we love to share the information. That's why I wanted to do this class today. So space requirements. The more space, the better. Big pumpkins can be grown in as little as 100 to 150 square feet, but huge ones take a lot more space, up to 1,000 feet per plant. And on that one plant, you're going to get one pumpkin if you want a big one. Last year, I used about a 340 square foot space and got about 947 pounder, which pretty good. It was about 25 foot long, maybe 18 foot wide, kind of an oval shape, which not ideal, but this whole thing's about learning and improving on previous years. So this year, my patch is about 540 square feet, so let's hope that translates to more weight gain. I also had to, so after last year, I sold the pumpkin and put that money into buying more compost. And I got a whole bunch of compost delivered, set it up, expanded the patch, and then I moved to a new house, so I had to do it again this last week. So if there's something to learn, know where you're going to grow your pumpkin before you buy the compost. The pros and cons of patch sizes. With a smaller patch, it's easier to manage, takes up less room. You don't need to buy as many soil amendments, as many fertilizers. With that, the cons are there's less room for vines. The pumpkin growth is limited, and you probably don't need to do a soil test to find out what kind of nutrition your soil has. But if you're going for a larger patch and a larger pumpkin, you're putting the stakes a lot higher on yourself, so you want to make sure that you have the space, and that if you're putting that much into it, you want to know what your soil has. So the cons of that being, you get less backyard. You have to do more of keeping your dogs out of the soil so they don't compact it and all that stuff. And then you just need to use a lot more amendments, from what I've found anyway. Now, just because I'm growing in a 540 square foot spot doesn't mean you need to. The current world record for the 150 square foot giant pumpkin challenge is 1,375 pounds. So you can absolutely grow a huge one in a pretty small space. You just have to really be cognizant of controlling all these parameters and basically feeling like this is a second job. So, yeah, so you don't have to use that big of a spot, but like I said, a lot of people will dedicate 1,000 square feet to just one pumpkin. And I'd like to get there at some point. So when it comes to amending your soil, pumpkins like a rich and well-drained soil. They don't like wet feet. I mean, what plants do like growing in a bog, other than, some carnivorous plants? You're not really going to find many that thrive in super wet conditions. You want to make sure your soil can breathe, that it's got some sand in it, and that you've got peat moss or coconut coir for moisture retention. You want to make sure that, no matter what, you're going to be watering 3 to 4 times a day, just because we're in a desert climate and these things will drink all the water you give them. Pretty important thing to do is get a soil test done. That way you know what you're working with. And when it comes to these soil tests, you do little samples here and there throughout your patch. You send it in a bag to a company like Western Labs. This is just one that specializes in giant pumpkin soil tests. So they'll tell you exactly what you have and exactly what you need to amend to actually have things in the optimal range. Last year I didn't do a soil test, so I added about 10 pounds arbitrarily, just kind of added stuff. 10 pounds of blood meal, which is a high nitrogen organic fertilizer, about 5 pounds of bone meal, 8 pounds of plant-tone tomato food, because pumpkins are heavy calcium feeders and so are tomatoes. I also added, probably 600 pounds of compost before everything started, but after we get pollinating, you're pretty much fertilizing all the time. Again, you don't have to do it that way. If you get a soil test done, they'll tell you what you need so you can do minimal fertilizing as the season progresses. So that's kind of one of those trade-offs. Do you want to spend every day fertilizing, or do you want to just water? Something to consider. So that's a resource for the soil test. And it'll cost about $57, maybe a little bit more with shipping, but they can also check for diseases. Out here, I think we have less disease pressure because things dry out so easily, and we just don't really have those conditions where a lot of these soil-bound pathogens can thrive. So the timeline, the earlier you can safely plant in the ground, the better. Our weather's kind of funky. We've had several days where it's in the high 70s, and then we hit a cold snap almost immediately after. So it's kind of a gamble. Right now is actually probably a good time to start looking at starting seeds indoors under a light, or if you're able to, if you have a south-facing window, they'll thrive pretty well for their first couple weeks indoors. Last year I planted in the soil April 29th. Still a little cold, we had some 45-degree nights still, so I covered the plants up with a clear plastic tote. You can go a step further, put a blanket on top of it with a couple rocks on there. Try to keep that heat that's built in the day. Ideal soil temps are about 70 to 80 degrees. Encourages healthier and faster root growth. Not always possible with our high desert climate and cold nights. One way around that is a lot of pumpkin growers in the more northern states, they'll use things like soil heating cables to kind of, control that ground, get it warmed up. And if you combine the soil heating cables with a clear plastic tote, you probably won't need to put a blanket on it at night. The continued timeline, so we start seeds early to mid-April. Right now is a good opportunity. I do have seeds here for sale from my pumpkin from last year, so if any of you are interested in purchasing any of these, they're $10 for 3 seeds. I've got about 12 packs right now, so something to keep in mind, or you've also got those resources that we showed in an earlier slide. Planting outdoors early May late April, early May, ideally. Vine burying is an important one because once you get this thing planted, the vines are going to sprawl out. And with every type of plant, more root equals more fruit. So you want to make sure that you have as many healthy roots growing as you can so that they all take up all that nutrition in the soil. All May you're going to be burying vines or until you run out of space. And ideally you want to time the pollination to be 70 to 100 days before any weigh off you're going to take it to. For the state fair, that would be right at the beginning of June. So you want to have at least 3 months for the fruit to be mature and for the seeds to be mature, because what good is a giant pumpkin if you can't take the seeds out and reuse them once they've adapted to our climate? I think this year, personally, I'm going to try to take mine to a regional layoff, so that gives me a little more time. Can look at going to layoffs end of September, early October. Unfortunately, the closest ones to us are going to be in places like Denver. So it's quite the pilgrimage to take a giant pumpkin 600 miles away. Early to mid-June is best to avoid pollinating during our 100-degree days. That's a huge one because once you start hitting 100-degree days, pollinations on pumpkin plants are a lot harder to keep alive. It's just that brutal, intense sunlight. So pollinating early June is probably the best bet if you're able to, but don't let that stop you from pollinating later on.
So the bees don't pollinate it, you have to pollinate it?
If your bees mean well, but they don't know what they're doing, and they can bring pollen from other people's plants.
Oh.
So if you want to make sure that your pollination, for one, is taking, because we spent all this time and effort making sure your plant's growing healthy, you want to be sure that it's going to be pollinated. So that's my biggest thing for controlling the pollination. Feeding every day once the fruit is set and growing, usually 10 to 14 days after pollination is when I start fertilizing. Yeah.
What do you actually mean by like, how do you know when pollination is?
We'll cover that in just a moment, yeah. So these things will grow fast once you start germinating them. Last year I started my seeds on April 12th. The seeds popped out of the soil 5 to 7 days later. You keep them indoor under a mix of artificial growing light and sunshine. I do that personally because once, no matter what you're going to put this thing outdoors, you want to acclimate it to the sun. So in my opinion, the earlier you can get sunlight on the plant, the better it is for the plant, the less shock it is to actually be out there full time. When it comes to acclimating, limit the sunshine to about an hour a day, build up as you can, extra half hour the next day, extra half hour the next day. They'll build up pretty quickly. So now we're on to the seed germination. Giant pumpkin seeds are thick, they're tough, they are not easy to open up on their own. One thing you want to do when you get your giant pumpkin seeds is take a nail file and very, very lightly file the edges on the flat side, not the facing side. You want to file the edges of the seed on the round side so that it just helps open up a little easier. If you don't do that, your seed might not germinate, or the seed shell might get stuck on the leaf and you start getting weird little damage on the first 2 leaves. You want those first 2 leaves to come out pretty much ideal so that your plant has a nice starting point. You want to soak the seeds for 30 minutes to an hour after filing the seed. And when you file it, you're only barely taking off the first little top layer to expose some color underneath. Once you see that darker change in color, you know you can stop filing that area. Soak it, and then minimum 1 gallon pot. I like to do 5-gallon pots, just because those things are gonna take off. They're gonna want all the food that's in the mix. So 3 parts seed starting mix, 1 part compost is a real easy little mixture. Real forgiving too. You don't have to worry about feeding it at that point either. You place the seed about 1 inch deep into the soil, flat. It just kind of helps. Once the seed breaks open, root will go down, seed will come up. You want to keep the seeds at least 75 degrees in the day, no lower than 65 at night, because that's just going to slow things down. And it's best to utilize at least 100-watt grow light to get these things started. And for time, you want to have them get at least 12 to 16 hours of light a day. During the seedling phase, this is a picture of one that's already planted outside. So these are the first leaves that will pop up on the seed. And then this first true leaf basically indicates the direction that the vine will start growing. So once you plant this thing outside, ideally you want to wait until the first true leaf is facing, and then the vine grows the opposite direction of the first true leaf. So that gives you a direction in your patch to kind of point things. And yeah, so this is like the tiny beginning of the vine. Once that gets a little bigger, it'll end up growing the opposite direction of that first leaf. You want to place in the ground, yeah, we just said that. Now, once things really start growing, you want to take into account the shape of your patch and what direction you want things growing. So, this is a picture of the one I grew last year. And back here was the base of the plant. And as you can see, these vines basically come off here, 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 opposite directions pretty much. They take turns going back and forth. But you want to make sure that you have enough room to really plant things out. So what a lot of growers will do is they'll grow in a Christmas tree shape, and if you can tell, it's more or less pyramid scheme style really. And as the vines grow, you'll want to bury the vines. So little info about the vine structure. You've got your main vine here in red. You got secondary vines that grow off of the main vine, and then these blue ones are called tertiary vines, which grow off of the secondaries. It's kind of still debated pretty heavily whether or not tertiary vines add more to the plant than they take away. Everything I've read and a lot of the growers I follow tend to not grow these tertiary vines, and they pretty much stay with the main vine and the secondaries. I don't see an issue with that, but I'm sure other people grow very successfully. I think one of the larger pumpkins that's ever been grown was grown off of a tertiary vine. So it's still heavily debated. When it comes to watering, they can drink up to 100 gallons of water a day if you have a 1,000 square foot plant. Probably a little more if you take into account evaporation with our high desert climate. Automated watering can save a lot of time. I'll be doing that for sure this year, because last year I was watering by hand 3 to 4 times a day. Not sustainable if you have a day job. Fertilizing and feeding took place during the evenings, because if you fertilize in the morning, that heat of the day can come in real quick and you can burn your plants. Pesticide and fungicides were also applied after the feeding and watering. That way you don't wash anything off of your plant. This year, what I'm going to be doing is using something called drip tape, and it's essentially drip lines. Sprinklers work as well, although you might get more spots that are wet, more spots that are dry. Drip lines or soaker hoses probably are the best bet for you having consistent water all throughout your garden. This is the vine burying. So as you can see here, there's this little nub here, and this is pretty much at the under every leaf. You'll see on each side, you'll see one of these little nubs. This is the beginning of a root. So what we do is we dig a little trench or just put some potting soil on top of that little root. I also like to add some mycos or azos. These are rooting bacteria that form a symbiotic relationship with the plant in the soil and essentially help facilitate faster root growth. To me, all this stuff helps a lot, just because, again, you're trying to grow something big, you want to give it as many opportunities to thrive as possible. And one way to do that is having beneficial rooting bacteria. Kind of like in Venom, right? How we got the alien that they help each other out. Yeah, anyway. It's a good relationship. So yeah, put some potting soil mixed with some of this rooting bacteria on top of each one of these little white nubs. Keep those watered, and then within several days, even if some of the soil washes off, you'll notice those roots are already taking form. When it comes to pests, this is the question I get asked the most, is how do we deal with the squash bugs? Unfortunately, This is what I had so many issues with myself and why it took me 4 years to get a big pumpkin, is because I thought I could do this organically. And don't get me wrong, you can absolutely do it organically. It's just gonna take a lot more time and attention. And after 2 years of pumpkins going soft and squishy on me from disease that these little squash bugs bring, I got tired of it and I used the nuclear option. We'll go over that too. So these squash bugs are going to be the things that you probably have to deal with the most, giving diseases to your plants. You look for the egg masses. When you're watering the plant, you'll see the squash bugs will come up from the soil and go up on the underside of your leaves. You can pick them off, you can put them in a little cup of water. It's a good way to deal with them while you're watering, but that's not going to make them go away. So they suck the juices out of the pumpkin leaves and transmit diseases like yellow vine disease. And this one specifically took out my plant 3 years in a row. It's also known as yellow vine decline, bacterial disease that affects pumpkins and other cucurbits. Yeah. Symptoms include like yellowing leaves, plant collapse. It looks a lot like underwatering. The leaves will do what's called flagging. They'll go from being strong to just looking like a flag on a non-breezy day. And the pumpkin itself will go soft on you and start rotting. Another thing you'll notice is that this is, it's so sad, this is my plant from 2023. As you can see, these are like the healthy, bright or dark green leaves, and this is all showing the effects of yellow vine disease. And it took me 2 years to actually realize that this was what was happening, which is why I started to use the more intense insecticides. What you'll notice on the vine tips is this is actually supposed to be a vine, but another effect it has is it slows all the growth, and you essentially stop seeing any stretching at the end of the vine. Everything stays close together, and you never get any growth further. This bamboo stick was a way for me to determine if the vines were actually still growing or not, and after several days of seeing that it hadn't moved an inch, you have to call it. Another pest that we deal with out here, they look like ladybugs, but they are not nearly as friendly. These are cucumber beetles. They look like ladybugs, except they're yellow, and they kind of blend into your pumpkin leaves too. They also bring bacterial wilt, squash mosaic virus, pretty much same effects that the squash bugs have, and they'll just ruin your season. Another one, everyone's going to deal with aphids on every type of garden plant. This is just how you can spot them in multi-generations, all big ones, little ones, different color ones. They suck the juices out of the plants, on the underside of leaves. And even with all the pest control I was doing last year, by the time it was September, there was no actually stopping aphids. You're just trying to manage their numbers. They also vector viruses to the pumpkin and squash plants. A survey conducted in the late 90s by OSU researchers concluded that watermelon mosaic virus was the most common type of virus found in Ohio pumpkin fields. That's just a reference of where they were doing the study. But again, they can bring trouble to your plants. With the insecticides, you have two types. You have systemic and a contact. Systemic ones are essentially fed through the root zone. They get absorbed through the plant tissues and distributed through the entire plant. And when a bug tries to eat off of your plant, it ingests this poison and gets sick and dies. This tends to be a little bit slower than if you were to just spray some stuff on the bugs, which is what a contact insecticide acts as. What I do is both. You provide the systemic protection early in the season, and that gives you about 4 or 5 weeks of active protection. And then you can start, once you start seeing bugs kind of all over your stuff, then you just take your contact insecticides and spray. Give the systemic another week or two before trying to reapply more, because you don't want to accidentally apply too much or too frequently. And contact insecticides wash off easily. So I was having to reapply basically nightly because my setup included a mist system. And a mist system is a good way to wash everything you just put off of your plant. These are some common ones. Don't worry, there's also more pictures, so it's not just a wall of text. So for contact and pesticides, we have bifenthrin is a common chemical name. You can find it under brand names like 7, Talc 7.9%. You can also use orchard spray as a contact insecticide. It doesn't contain this ingredient, but using multiple types of contact insecticides go a long way to preventing these bugs from getting a resistance. Systemic insecticides, a heavily used one in the pumpkin growing community is called imidacloprid. And this is actually the most widely used insecticide in modern agriculture. So even if you're getting your lettuce and your organic stuff at Sprouts, this is what they're using on it. There's a lot of back and forth of whether or not you should ingest things that are grown this way. But these are giant pumpkins, we're not ingesting any of this stuff, and the only things that would be possibly ingesting it are bees, but we have a way to keep them safe with this too. Some brand names you can find this chemical is BioAdvance 3-in-1. It's marketed as a tree and shrub insecticide. You can also get Bonide systemic granules. Those you just pour on the soil and they incorporate. The other ones are a liquid that you can mix into a bucket of water and pour throughout your garden.
And you find that this has been effective against squash bugs?
Yeah. So this is the rotation I was using last year, and I still have most of this stuff for this year. So this is the Talc, this is the contact insecticide, the 7 is a contact. These are the systemic granules. We've got an orchard spray, we've got the tree feed and protect, and a rose and flower care. This one has a little bit of food in it too, so I would avoid using that one too late in the season because you don't want to over-apply food. This is a dilution rate. Some of these things you have to use off-label because they're not, big companies not going to say, hey, giant pumpkin growers who make up 1% of the gardening community. So this is just use about 1/3 of an ounce per gallon for this contact insecticide. You would never really need more than a 1/2 ounce per gallon. And this is off of a giant pumpkin message board. So these people are extremely generous with providing examples that they've used and what's worked for them. Apply it at night as a foliar spray on the entire plant. Because again, you don't want to apply this stuff when the bees are active. And so you want to make sure this thing, you spray when there's no bugs out there that you want to avoid killing. And you want to also avoid spraying this on the fruit itself. So this is one of 6 squash bugs I encountered all season last year because of my protocols for making sure they weren't going to take me out again. The only other one a few that I saw, 5 of them were dead, 1 was alive. Versus having to actively pick 5 or 6 every couple days. Fungicides, you're eventually going to have to deal with powdery mildew, which presents like this. It looks like a bunch of white spots all over your leaves. Shade cloth will make this appear earlier, and fungicides will slow the onset and progression significantly, but you're never not going to have it. Something with these Atlantic giants, when you breed for size, and that happens over years and years and decades, you're essentially, when you grow for size, you're growing for specific traits. You're not growing for disease resistance, and over that many years, these just become more susceptible to more pests and diseases. These are a couple types of fungicides I was using. We have Immunox multi-purpose fungicide, Eagle 20. Both of these are systemic insecticides. Much like the systemic pesticides, they're taken up through the plant tissues, although you can apply these directly to the underside of leaves as a foliar spray. This one here is called Daconil. It is a contact fungicide. So much like with the pesticides, with the systemics, you're applying every 10 to 14 days, something like that. And if you're applying 10 to 14 days, you don't necessarily have to use the spray contact insecticides as often. But eventually you're like, all right, we're this far into this, I want to make sure we're protected. So you start to double up. Eagle 20 does not list dosage for pumpkins, so off-label dilution rates are to be used. This is a comment off the Backyard Giant Pumpkin Growers Facebook group. Eagle 20 used how often? 15 milliliters or ½ teaspoon per gallon, starting around beginning of July, every 2 to 4 weeks. And again, mix it in like a hand sprayer under the leaves. But I cannot stress enough, be safe about this, because these are hard chemicals and you don't want to have this stuff going through your skin, you don't want to breathe this stuff, you don't want it going in your eyes. So you essentially want to cover up completely, wear your thickest stuff in the heat of the summer, and wear a mask, wear glasses, just try to protect yourself. When mixing pesticides and insecticides, wear your protective clothing. These can be mixed together, fungicides and pesticides. Just be aware of any separating in the water. If you see stuff separate in the water, try not to do that. So you can do like little tests with like a jar of water and put both of the chemicals in there. If you see separating, do them individually. It's best to begin treating the soil with a systemic insecticide drench or the granules. Spreading of granules before planting. This will give the young plants a chance to become established before they get attacked. And again, with these pesticides, apply before dawn or after dusk. This is to save the bees. And here's a great way to apply this stuff. It's all covered up. You got a backpack sprayer, or you can use the deck sprayer, anything that allows for that. This year, after having used one of these every night, I think I might spring for a backpack automated sprayer, so you can just spray it as you need and not have to do this every 2 to 3 minutes. And so this is a two-parter here. This is a male flower of a giant pumpkin plant that is about to open. Once you see, so if you look here, this is a greener one that's kind of blending into the vine. This one is not ready to open, but when you see the pumpkin flowers start to turn a yellow color and start to look a little more like the top is going to open, that's how you know they're going to open the following morning. So when it comes to protecting the bees, we only want to keep the flowers that we're intending to pollinate with. You'll notice that once you're growing these, you'll get mostly male flowers for the first couple weeks up until probably first week of June or something like that. And then you'll start seeing little baby female flowers open, or start to show up on the plant. So personally, I cut all the male flowers away until I start seeing female flowers. The night before you see these things open, you want to either tie off the female flowers and the male flowers, tie it off a string or a rubber band, a clip, something like that. You can cover it with a paper cup, whatever you want to do just to keep the bugs out. This is what we're doing to control the pollination.
How can you tell a male and a female flower?
Funny you should ask.
Oh,
So this is a female flower. It literally looks like a baby pumpkin on a stem with a flower on top, and the male flower is all stem and then flower. And so you'll see a lot more of these before you'll see these. So if you stay diligent and checking every day, which I'm sure if you've gone this far with growing a giant pumpkin, you're going to be checking 5 times a day. So once you see one of these, you'll know that you're probably 10 to 14 days out from pollinating. And then you can start keeping other flowers on there that you wish to pollinate with. This is the inside of the flower. So the male flower has a little stamen and a bunch of pollen on the end. And the female flower has basically a receptacle. So when it comes to pollinating, you take the petals off of here. And in the case of this male flower, you cut this off, put it in some water overnight in your house. That's a good way to do it. I try to have at least 3 male flowers to ensure I have good pollination on the female flower. And what's even better is if you can cross-pollinate. It won't necessarily make a difference on the fruit this season, but if you're intending to grow for next season, it's always better to have new genetics introduced than to rely on a pumpkin that was pollinated with its own genetics. So this is what the pollination process would look like. So got the female flower open and I take the petals off and I basically just treat it like a paintbrush. You're making a painting inside the flower. You want to make sure everything's covered. And these flowers smell great, by the way. And this is just showing the vines that I've buried and, just a little bit of overview of the plant itself. Now, at this time, the plant wasn't huge. It had probably taken up about half of the total growing area. don't worry because it will fill out in the next week or two. Now, with it being hot and dry here, we're a mile up in the atmosphere. We have an extremely high UV rating on any given summer day. You want to be able to ensure that your vine tips don't get burned. A lot of this new growth on these plants, if left with no shade whatsoever, they will scorch. And, you know, that's not going to fare well for having nice big leaves that are going to feed your pumpkin. So, a shade fabric structure is a must in my opinion. A lot of people at lower altitudes don't necessarily have to deal with that because they have another mile of atmosphere filtering that sunlight away. Late spring to early summer, you know, we're going to have crazy windstorms. That's unavoidable. You have to plan on this, and you have to be sure that you build your shade structure well, and if you don't, you'll see what happens. A mist system goes a long way in reducing plant temperature. Again, with these 100-degree days and pollinating, you want to reduce the temperature of your plant any way possible. So we treat this like a swamp cooler. We want to introduce mist onto the plant, and the water evaporates, taking away some of that heat with it. This is a mist timer that I'm going to be using this year. I cannot stress enough that using a timer for the mist is so important because last year I didn't have this timer, and I would turn on the hose to the mist timer, wait about a minute, turn it off, walk inside for about 20 minutes, and repeat the process over and over and over and over and over again until it was no longer brutally hot outside. These timers can be programmed for as little as 10 to 30 seconds over many intervals in a day. And manually turning the mist on and off is time consuming and often leads to watering the plant more than you're misting it. Not necessarily an issue in my opinion because these things are going to drink as much water as you give them. Now, I mentioned how important it is to build your shade structure well. I am not handy, and this is what happens if you do not build your shade structure well. This is that June 17th windstorm we had. That was 5 days after I had pollinated the pumpkin that I wanted to grow. And as you can tell by the shape of all this stuff, those PVC pipes and fabric were just smacking my pumpkin like it owed them money. And my wife here, she can attest to how stressed out I was that night.
It was bad.
I went through every range of emotions. I was like, no, what's happening? I'm going to try to save it, to just like, I'm never doing this again. I'm just cutting it, I'm just giving up. And then actually the following morning, I pollinated the pumpkin that I ended up growing and taking to the state fair. So once you accept defeat, you can have some great success. No, just go please. I don't want to relive that. So this was the damage that was done to that pumpkin. It doesn't look like much. You know, this is actually probably a pretty close size to what it was at the time. But once you have damage on a pumpkin that's that small, this thing's going to swell up, and that scar is going to be bigger than you are. So this is one of those things where I was like, okay, I have this growing. It can be okay, but I'd rather a perfectly pristine pumpkin if I can. This video, it was after I took this pumpkin off the plant. I just cut it open to see cross sections, and those are all the little seeds forming inside. This pumpkin was only 14 or 16 days old at the time that I cut it, but you can see just how many seeds are inside that, and how the damage did not go very far past the skin. It just kind of went into the skin layer a little bit.
Had you, if you had kept growing it, like, could you have saved the seeds from it? I mean, like,
Yeah,
the seeds have been damaged?
The seeds would have been totally viable, but it would have been an ugly pumpkin. Yeah. So if you can see on here, I have this sitting on not garden soil, because garden soil is going to be wet all the time. You don't want your pumpkin sitting on something that's constantly wet. So I use a 3/4 inch foam insulation board, put that on the soil, and then put a layer of play sand on top of it. The play sand acts as a friction reduction so that the pumpkin can stretch and grow as it needs to without the bottom splitting open or any other issues like that coming into play. With the insulation board, you want to cut a bunch of holes, drill a bunch of holes through it for drainage, so that any water that does collect, or rain or anything like that, it just comes off the pumpkin, goes through the sand, goes through the holes. You don't worry about rot. Now you want to cover your pumpkin with a king size sheet, because we want to go big, right? You want to cover it with a king size white cotton sheet 24/7, unless you're looking in for any issues, measuring things. This helps keep the skin of the fruit young, keeps the relative humidity on the skin higher. If you go without this, you can run into skin cracking, the skin can mature faster, and you just don't get as big of a pumpkin. Now, even at this size, this is the day before it was harvested, the skin's pretty fragile, so you want to be as careful as possible and try not to touch your pumpkin. It's tough, but especially when you start trying to move things around and try to get it in the right position so that it doesn't grow into the vine, I've put notches in it with my fingernail without even realizing it. And again, those things will swell up and be the size of your arm. So yeah, the cotton sheet helps prevent the cracking, and it also dries out quickly once wet. I didn't have any rot issues with my misting system on this, so it's just one of those, you want to protect your pumpkin. Now after pollinating, what you want to do is, the flower goes from an upright position, and over a couple days it starts to lay down, and naturally what it wants to do is it wants to grow butt end down, and that's totally a valid way to grow a giant pumpkin. They call that Cinderella style. But if we're wanting to make sure that we have, enough space for it, most people tend to grow these flat. And as it's laying down, so you don't really want to mess with the pumpkin too much when it's about this size. But this is just an example of how you don't want to grow it, because as you can see, that's the top, I guess, of the flower. Of the pumpkin, and once these get to a huge size, you really run the risk of the pumpkin growing onto the vine and cutting itself off of the vine. So we want to make sure that the vine stays parallel with the plant, and we essentially end up growing a vine up in a curved shape. Yeah, so if you want to grow it Cinderella style, it's totally valid, but you're probably going to have to deal with more rot concerns. Yeah, just be ultra careful. So at this size, you don't want it to get essentially staying like that the whole time. So once it starts laying down and starts swelling up, maybe to the size of a basketball, around then you're safe to start kind of moving it tiny bits in the heat of the day. You don't want to do this in the morning, you don't want to do this in the evening. You want to do this when the plant is nice and warm and the tissues are not brittle. Just tiny adjustments over a couple days to make sure you get it flat, horizontal, goes a long way. Now, without having my soil test last year, it's likely that I underfed my plant. What happens if you don't do a soil test is you also run the risk of overfeeding your plant. So about 10 days after pollinating, I began feeding the plant every night, and I mean every night. Base nutrients were mixed at about a 15-gallon dosage for an entire 340 square foot plant, because you don't want to go too heavy on it. I mixed mine in a hose end sprayer and applied it at a low-medium strength, because you don't want to apply fertilizer that's too heavy on the leaves, or else you'll burn the leaves, less photosynthetic activity, less gains. Always better to overfeed or to underfeed than overfeed. A couple pumpkin growers say you don't want to be a moron. These are some ones that I was using. This is the only thing that's really missing out of this whole collection here is molasses. So molasses goes a long way in feeding soil microbes because it's sugar, right? And it's also got some extra little stuff in there that probably is beneficial. This is the root burying hormone that I used. This is something called Master Blend. It is a 3-part hydroponic fertilizer, and that was the basis of my main food source, is mixing this stuff in a 15-gallon concentration. I also use something over here called Cool Bloom. It is a bloom enhance product. It helps facilitate more flowers and more of that stuff. Pumpkins love fish and seaweed fertilizer. I also used humic liquid. This helps with nutrient uptake and converting things in the soil that make it easier for the plant to uptake. Calcium magnesium supplement was a big one. Calcium is a hugely important nutrient for pumpkins. Lack of calcium will lead to splitting open. I also used silica. I don't know how necessary that is because clay soils in New Mexico have a lot of silica in there, but I applied this as a liquid form to make sure it was bioavailable. These are some ones that I used. I purchased these myself, and the owner of the company, he's a local guy for Gonzo Farms. He was enthusiastic about how his products, helped get this pumpkin this huge, and he was kind enough to provide some supplements over here that we're going to be raffling at the end of the class. So liquid kelp, huge. You can never use too much kelp. And these two are, again, they're products that are microbes. They help with nutrient uptake, the symbiotic relationship in the soil and the roots. It's starting to become pretty well known that these living microbes in general are so much more important than regular fertilizer. I'm sure that's the case, and you'll have people like cannabis growers doing a lot of living soil, and the living soil is intended to feed the plant, you feed the soil to feed the plant instead of feeding the plant itself. A lot of these fertilizers are kind of heavy in terms of salt, and too much salt kills your plant. That being said, you do not have to use all this different stuff. Just a regular tomato food goes a long way for this stuff. If you're new to the fertilizing in this way, don't overcomplicate it. Regular tomato food will help a lot. So this is some information about calcium and plant physiology. Calcium is not only important for cation exchange, it's also an essential element for the structure of the pumpkin plant. Calcium enters the root hairs and forms an organic compound called calcium pectate. Calcium pectate products, they build strong cell walls, and they're found in the cementing layer between plant cells. They're basically the glue of the plant. It's carried throughout the plant by the transportation stream, the veins in the plant. Once you cut a pumpkin away from the vine, you'll see a bunch of open holes all through there, and that's what we're talking about. That's the transportation system. So the plant organs that have stomates, which are pores, you'll see those on the underside of leaves, which is why when we're applying fertilizer or foliar feeding, you want to spray the underside of leaves because that's where those stomas, pores are open. That's essentially where they breathe. So, such as mature leaves, they'll transpire more than organs that do not have stomates. Just like we have pores, we sweat through our pores. In general, leaves tend to have more calcium than the fruit would have, and if you have a leaf that has an adequate amount of calcium, you can still find that you have a calcium deficiency in a large pumpkin. That's a little more if you get tissue tests done. I know a lot of pumpkin growers will take clippings of certain leaves and send those off to be tested too mid-season so they know what do I have to do for the next couple weeks before the grow-off. Adequate calcium provides for strong cell walls, and strong cell walls are less prone to disease. Calcium deficiencies in pumpkins may result in cracking or blossom end rot. Any type of rot, it's a nightmare, and I've lost enough pumpkins where it's just so demoralizing to go through this much work, this many weeks, just to have, it's rotting because I didn't give it enough calcium. The benefits are, you want to have enough calcium to, in short, if you don't have enough calcium, this is where you're always going to have to deal with a split. That's the thinnest part of the pumpkin, is always the bottom. I don't know why, but that's just how they are. They're the thinnest, and that's where you'll more than likely have cracking. Boron is borax. You mix it with your laundry or your detergent. That's also an important one. And if you don't have enough boron, that can inhibit calcium uptake too. So with that master blend fertilizer I was using, that's one that has boron mixed in, so it was less of a factor, but it never hurts to just add, you know, a little teaspoon of boron every week, something like that, just to make sure that you're providing enough. And boron doesn't necessarily stay in the soil either, it washes out really easily, much like nitrogen does. Most pumpkin growers have high amounts of calcium and potassium in their soil. This can lead to a deficiency of boron. You know, things can lock each other out if they're too much in a high concentration. Everything has to be well balanced. Too much boron is bad. Boron itself is not held or absorbed by the soil. And the best source of it is the organic matter itself, also borax. Calcium does not equal milk. This is another thing that I hear a lot. I've had several people ask if I feed milk to my pumpkins. I understand where that question comes from. The calcium that's in milk is not in a plant available form. However, milk does have lactobacillic bacteria in it, so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's just much less stinky ways to apply beneficial bacteria than milk. So these are both ones that I use, CalMag Plus, which has a little iron in there, or Mad Farmer CalMag. These are ones that I bought locally. And with the CalMag, I didn't check how much I was using. I just kind of poured an arbitrary-ish amount, what felt good, and I didn't have any problems. But that, again, don't use more than seems necessary. So this is a hose end sprayer. This is a way I was applying my stuff last year. And I was hand watering all last year, so that's very tedious, but as far as applying fertilizers, this is a perfectly good way to do it. You make sure that you add water mostly first, and then you add your fertilizers in there. Excuse me. Some fertilizers can actually interact and can't cause them to fall out of dissolution, precipitate out. So you want to make sure you're following a correct order. For instance, with the Master Blend 3-part, it was a mixture of a base fertilizer, calcium nitrate, and Epsom salt. And you had to make sure that the calcium nitrate was added last, because if you add that first, it'll dissolve in, then you add your other stuff, calcium nitrate will precipitate out and won't dissolve. So, you know, just be aware of the instructions on any fertilizers. If they're multi-part, just follow the order they're supposed to be used. Another way is a fertilizer injector. These are a little more complicated. I don't have any experience with those, but essentially you can just get a big bucket of water, have a fertilizer injector, and it will dose automatically as you water your plants. I don't suggest doing that unless you have, lawn staffy in that way. This was my nightly routine, so this is the base fertilizer, the Master Blend. That's the main fertilizer. I mix it into some water, some calcium, magnesium, arbitrary amount, liquid kelp I measured, and this is what I was doing every single night. So there's the raptor roots that I was using. We want to make sure that all this stuff is easily absorbed into the soil. We have some Zamina's elixir. We have humic liquid also helping for availability, plant nutrient uptake. And then, so since I'm spraying it like this, you want to make sure you're not applying it at the heaviest setting or anything like that. I'd rather have it be, under strength and just keep applying it until it runs out evenly all over the plant versus just, oh, I ran out of everything I mixed and I still have half the plant to water. When you do that, you run the risk of burning your plant. So this, once you get further along in the process, what you're mostly doing at that point is maintenance. You're feeding every night, you're spraying, hopefully not every day for bugs if you're using the systemic insecticides. But something I ended up doing I started every day after day 14 is measuring for weight estimation. And so the way you measure for a weight estimation, they have these nifty little online calculators that you can use, and you basically use soft tape, and you do, let's see, this one is over the top, so vine end to butt end at the ground level, you measure that. Then you do side to side on the plant up to the ground level, and then you do around as a circumference. For this one I had to tape 2 of these 140-inch measuring tapes together to have one that was long enough. And then you take those numbers, you put it into this calculator, and then it tells you the estimated weight based on other people's pumpkins. And this is a formula that gets updated as more people put in data points, so it kind of averages things out, gives you a nice number of what you can think you're growing. What I found is that my estimations were off, not because of measuring incorrectly, but because I did not put an even enough layer of sand over my entire insulation board. I had a heavy spot of sand and I figured the pumpkin would push some of that out of the way. That didn't happen. It just ended up growing kind of concave over that part of the sand. And then, so when we lifted it up, there was a concave spot that threw off my estimated weight. This pumpkin was on track to beat the state record last year, but because of that issue with the sand, we fell short by 40 pounds. Okay, stress management. You will have nightmares about your pumpkin. I had them almost every other night. People coming through, kicking the pumpkins, animals coming through, chewing them, or you just go out there after a rainstorm in your nightmare and it's just off the plant. A spouse or a partner is a great way to offload that stress, but you have to take them on dates. You have to remind them that you care about them. They've earned it. They've had to deal with you taking all this time, 1 to 2 hours a day on a flipping pumpkin. So, I also read Apollo 13, a disaster a book about going to the moon, and these guys, you know, the idea was these guys they had real stakes going on. They didn't know if they were coming home. I don't have to worry about this gourd. Puts things into perspective. So now you've got a huge pumpkin. How are you going to move it? If it's over 400 pounds, it's best not to try to brute force it with numbers, and you're going to strain some relationships with your friends if you try to get them to lift too big of a pumpkin. So you don't want to grow yourself into a corner. This is an example of my backyard last year, and as you can see, we just have this little fence here, this little gate, and it became way too big to even try to consider moving it over that fence. So oh man, I grew myself into a corner. What am I going to do? Well, it was too big to use any of these lifting tarps. These things are usually good to hold about 500 pounds of pumpkin. And again, you have to make sure you buy your friends some drinks, whatever they need, some pizza. But mine was a little bit bigger than that. So these are some other methods that people use. This is a tripod with 16-foot posts, an engine hoist that can hold, you know, a 2,000-pound engine, and lifting straps with some rope underneath. Now it's important to know how to tie knots if you're doing it this way. I flunked out of Boy Scouts, so I didn't know how to do knots very well. When it came time to try to lift my pumpkin, we were getting it lifted and it just came apart. So we had to figure something else out.
And it didn't break?
It did what?
It didn't break?
No, it did. The rope broke, but that's probably due to my lack of knowing how to actually secure these things. So my gate was too small, and this is a screenshot from my front yard. So we had this massive pumpkin going over my house, which made the owner of the house super nervous.
Does insurance cover a pumpkin coming through?
That's a good question. That's not something I wanted to ask. So these are some links to the regional weigh-offs. New Mexico State Fair loves big pumpkins, but they are not an official weigh-off place if you want to get your pumpkin certified by the Giant Pumpkin Commonwealth. So this is a list of the different weigh-offs that they had for the Rocky Mountain region last year. A lot of these are going to be in the same place this year, just on different days. This is a link for that information for the GPC weigh-offs. The GPC, the Giant Pumpkin Commonwealth, they were essentially the governing body that creates the standards and regulations to ensure the quality of fruit, fairness of competition, recognition of achievement, fellowship, and education for all the participating growers and weigh-off sites. The New Mexico State Fair is not affiliated with this, and any records that would be broken would not be officially recognized unless weighed at an official GPC weigh-off. That was a trade-off I had to make last year. With everything else that had happened, almost losing the pumpkin a couple times, is it going to fall on my house, all that stuff, we just decided to take it to the state fair because trying to figure out a convoy situation to get this thing 600 miles up and 600 miles back just wasn't in the cards for me. Now, what do you do after the weigh-off? pumpkin patches may be interested in purchasing it. Don't worry, it wasn't my house. So this is what happened. I sold it to a pumpkin patch down in Carlsbad, and they displayed it up until Halloween, and then after Halloween, that's what they did with it, and that's how they harvested the seeds. Now, I'm sure I would have ended up with more seeds if it was harvested a little bit more delicately. But yeah, so once you've got this big old pumpkin, you've got it certified, you know the way, you could carve it for Halloween. I think that's probably the least stressful thing to do. You get all the control, you can make it a cool design. And you wouldn't want to make any pies because they wouldn't taste like anything. They would just be watery, stringy. It's honestly best to use things like the small pumpkins from the other type of pumpkin family. Now, how much did I spend? Soil and compost, 400 to 500. Nutrients and supplies, which I still have some, 200 to 300. Hose and sprayer, 20 bucks. Pesticides and fungicides, 100 to 200 bucks. Still have a lot. Hand pump sprayer for the applying pesticides, 20 to 30 bucks. Shade cloth, about 60 to 80. The mist system was 30. Seeds were 30. Water throughout the season, about 250. So for this, it run me about almost 1,300, 1,400 bucks.
What about the crane and the transport?
That man did it out of the kindness of his heart.
Wow.
Yeah. So Gino's Crane Enterprise, if anybody ever needs something big moved, just don't take up his services when I need to move my pumpkin, please. Now, was it worth it? Yeah. You can follow my upcoming season on Albuquerque Gardening on YouTube. I'm also, look at that, I'm promoting today's event. Yeah, so this is where I'll be posting this class from today. You can find this on my YouTube page later this week. You can also follow me on Instagram at Citrus in Your Eye. Just imagine putting some lemon in your eye. And that's how you can find me. Does anybody have questions?
In the beginning, you said, I think on the first or second slide, you said 10 pounds of blood,
Blood.
bone meal, 5 pounds bone meal, 8 pounds plantain tomato food.
Yeah.
Did you incorporate that in the dirt before you even put the plant in there?
Yes.
That whole amount there?
Yeah, that was all pre-season.
And that was for how many feet worth of growing area?
About 340.
Okay.
I figure that's just a fair sort of amount to put in for that size without it being too much anything. Again, it's always best to underdo it than overdo it. But with organic fertilizers, you get a little more wiggle room. These things break down over time. So just, if it looks like too much to an eye, you know it's too much. Yeah. But honestly, if they also have like those big 20-pound bags of garden tone fertilizer, like Home Depot, something like that. One of those would probably go a long way if you just mix it all around. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, when you're talking about the flowers that in that windstorm that wrecked one of your previous pumpkins, just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, is that normally they would continue to set flowers all the way up until the heat basically tells the plant to quit doing. So if you had a situation like that, you would potentially be able to pollinate that pumpkin, pollinate a new one, and continue your season?
Yes. Yeah, and that's only up to a certain point though, because once the pumpkin actually starts growing significantly, the plant slows down the vine spreading, it slows down flowering. It essentially tells the hormones in the plant, switch gears, we got something to keep alive.
I was mostly curious because it seems like every June here we get some kind of storm that kind of wrecks things. So I just
Yeah. One thing that might help a lot with that, on top of having the overhead shade, is put in some, fence posts around there and use some of that black weed fabric around. That will probably go a long way in reducing the overall gusts that your plant will feel. After that windstorm, I noticed there were some of the outskirts of the vines that I had that had come unrooted. So the more protection you can provide on the sides is going to go a long way too. Yeah.
How much sun does that plant need? Our backyard set up where the sun comes up on the east, drops on the west, follows my backyard.
So, yeah, my backyard was, the way we had it patch was this way, east was this way, house was west. And we got probably 8 to 10 hours of direct sunlight a day, and then ambient sunlight for the rest of the day, rest of the morning. But the more hours of sunlight you can get, the better. There's only so much you can do with that though, but you'll absolutely still get a 500-pound pumpkin on 6 hours of direct sunlight. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just on the pollination, because like when I grew my pumpkin, I didn't pollinate it. I mean, obviously it was a lot smaller. So you're taking it from itself, you're pollinating itself.
Yes, and if you have a second plant to pull flowers off of, that helps too, as far as genetic diversity for the seeds that'll be grown from that plant. But yeah, it's totally possible and okay to self-pollinate it with flowers from itself.
How do you preserve the seeds? How do you get the seeds? Then dry them or wash them, or what do you do?
Yeah, washing them is probably a good idea to get that skin and any gunk that's from the inside of the pumpkin off, and then just let them air dry over several days. And once it's been, over a week, something like that, then you can start to put them in airtight containers. You don't want to do that too early and risk mold.
At 100 gallons per day, what was your water bill like? Or like a break?
It wasn't that much worse than you might think. Regularly, our water bill was something like 70, 80 bucks a month during the winter. During the summer, it was like 120. Nothing crazy as far as an increase. I wasn't putting down 100 gallons a day because my plant was much smaller. And we also had a separate side vegetable garden. So it's not going to break the bank as far as that goes, but you'll probably feel guilt every time you want to buy a new supplement or anything like that.
Where do you live where your bill's only that much?
Well, I mean, we were in the Northeast Heights, but now we're a little bit closer to the university area, and our landlord, that's my landlord's problem this year. So.
I have a question. Did you name the pumpkin, or have you named any of your pumpkins in the past?
Naming the pumpkin is probably one of the more fun and silly things you can do. We named this one Baby Lucas Mintonio. Just one, Baby Lucas is funny. It's an odd little thing, and then Vintonio was because we watched this McMillions documentary about the Monopoly McDonald's scam that went on, and this kid's name was Vintonio at the end of it. We found that hilarious, so you want to make it something personal that you enjoy. Well, I can't stress enough how much I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their Sunday to come learn this class, to talk pumpkins, and I so appreciate every one of you for coming in and listening, being a part of this. And if anybody is interested in seeds, like I said, there's three seeds per pack for $10. I'd be happy to help you. Thank you.